Hello and welcome to the brand new edition of Upfront, and joining the brand new edition of the show, I am Kang Tae-ri. This week, we're going upfront on the recent UN debut of the South Korean president.
President Park successfully concluded a 3-day visit to the United Nations. The first event for the president was attending the UN Climate Summit. In her keynote speech, President Park emphasized the efforts made by the Korean government to tackle global problems.
To deal with climate change is a key part of this initiative.
At the United Nations General Assembly, President Park also gave a speech in order to galvanize international support for unification of the Korean Peninsula.
통일된 한반도는 핵무기 없는 세계의 출발점이자 인권 문제에 대한 근본적인 해결책이며 안정 속에 협력하는 동북아를 구현하는 시발점이 될 것입니다. 세계에서 유일하게 남아있는 이런 분단의 장벽을 무너뜨리는데 세계가 함께 나서 주시기 바랍니다.
It was the first time a South Korean president attended the UN Security Council summit. President Park Geun-hye successfully concluded her debut on the UN stage and maintained a hectic schedule during her trip. How can we assess the president's visit?
And for this in-depth and upfront discussion, we are joined by Mr. Shin Dong-ik, to my left, Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And also, we have Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung University, as well as Mr. Lee Jong-soo, not such a new face, I would say, co-president of Sustainable Development Global Network. Thanks so much for joining us today, making your time available. Now, I'm going to start off with you because you actually flew out to New York with the president and came back recently. Your job is basically overlooking the multilateral side of diplomacy for Korea. So what role did you play for this UN debut of the South Korean president?
It's quite diverse, but in my ministry, I'm in charge of multilateral and global issues. For example, United Nations and Security Council, and ODA, development cooperation, and human rights and humanitarian assistance, and public and cultural affairs, and lastly, legal affairs, legal issues. So in a sense, it's a diverse and multilateral aspects I'm in charge in the ministry.
So I guess the UN week or the General Assembly week is the highlight of your career, I would say, because we do say the UN meetings are sort of like the core of multilateral diplomacy, right?
Right. And the UN is a very unique and universal organization that where almost every country on earth is represented. Currently, there are 193 nations as member states, and each nation gets one seat and one vote, whether it is rich and poor or big and small. Right. So the subject like the very eminent subject like Ebola, or climate change crisis, or terrorism. The subjects are being discussed, and also that's where that the UN is producing the certain action and the plan and to resolve these issues. Particularly, we are dealing with this sort of problems. UN is the best place to do multilateral diplomacy. For Korea's perspective, we are interested in peace, security, stability on the Korean Peninsula. Korea must work with UN system and with the other 192 countries to serve and advance Korea's national interest effectively, efficiently.
But because we have just so many countries, over 190 countries, that could take time and it just makes things a lot complicated. What would be some of the benefits of multilateral diplomacy as opposed to bilateral diplomacy, do you
think? Bilateral diplomacy, by definition, is between two countries. So the issues involved are specific to two countries, and it progresses based on the reciprocal arrangement basis. But if you have more than 3 countries, now you're gravitating towards more acceptable arrangements or principles that are many countries. So it tends to involve more universal principles and more generally applicable arrangements. But this is very complex because it's not just two countries. Now, if you involve tens of, even hundreds of countries, that gets really difficult and sometimes impossible to pull through. But I think there's the opportunity and the risk for Korea, countries like Korea and the middle power having a aspiration to be a soft power country.
Right.
UN is a very important venue, as expressed by Mr. Ryu, to test and display our ability and capability to be a leader.
Okay, I guess to sort of stay relevant on the global stage, and you know,
Right.
UN debut of the South Korean president certainly helped, I would say, this time around. So, in your efforts in making this trip possible, what was your focal point?
Focal point is foreign ministry, including myself, and as Professor and Mr. Liu mentioned, to maximize the success in our multilateral diplomacy. So we prepare for 4 meetings basically. First one is the General Assembly, the keynote statement.
Right.
And secondly is for the first time my president made a very important statement in the Security Council.
Right.
And thirdly, another different meeting on education, global education first initiative. And lastly, and another keynote speech in the climate summit meeting. So we coordinate with the Secretariat and having request for my president who will deliver at the key part on whole session. So opening statement or the very core part of the group discussion. And second part of our job is draft those speeches and statements. It's a long process
I
and
bet.
very painful and time consuming. But so far we believe it was successful because that message was clearly delivered to the members of 192. And we like to show our image as the moderate and very constructive middle power among whole UN memberships. In my sense, it was well received, and we got the broad support to the foreign policy in general, including the North Korean policy and reunification policy. So, in one word, my president and our delegations are quite satisfied on the visit and then participation in UN General Assembly.
We need to see climate action not as a burden, but as an opportunity. Investing in the chance to unlock new energy industries and jobs can ignite fresh engines of future growth. Korea will work to submit next year our plan to support the post-2020 climate regime. We will also work with bodies like the Green Climate Fund and the GGGI to share and spread our experience.
How did you come to speak at the climate summit to begin with?
So Korea's stance is quite unique. As a middle power, our position is in the middle between the far advanced Western countries and other developing and poor countries. Even on the issue of climate change, our job and our role is playing our bridging role between the two groups and two sides. So we are asked to come to the opening part of the climate change and stress the importance of the new climate change convention. It should be concluded by next year, 2015, just 1 year before. We need to collect our political wills among 193 countries. So my president made a clear statement requesting all members should join in this negotiation to produce the very successful the convention. And also President stressed that this climate change is not a burden, but it can be a chance, opportunity to improve our technology. And while we are countering the climate change problems, so in whole context of the creative economy, we like to provide our own skills, and we have to mobilize the fund. So you know the Global Climate Fund Secretariat is located in Songdo. So we are aiming to mobilize about 100 billion US dollars. Those funds will be used to provide the capacity building to those developing countries. So this is a win-win solution. Our role is to try to satisfy both sides, the developed countries and developing countries. That's why Korea was selected. My president delivered her keynote speech and opening part.
Yeah, so she certainly promised an increase in Korea's input on regarding this issue, and I really like the part where she called for all the leaders to look at this issue as a business opportunity. That's going to convince a lot of countries. But do you think her promises like this, or her speech at the UN Climate Summit, do you think she can actually help Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's initiative on global warming and climate change?
Certainly, I believe so. I believe Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appreciate the President Park's role and the Korean government's effort in climate change issue. I guess there are a few points that I would like to make. Is one, that some people are saying the UN meetings is big words but no action. But President Park galvanized the world leaders to take action on this problem. And she shows that how Korea is doing this. And also she mentioned that Korea's green energy initiative to use the science and technology and innovation to tackle this problem. And she showed the idea other countries to replicate what Korea has been doing. And then also she sent the message that, well, Korea now will take, as the Mr. Shin mentioned, to role as middle power country to lead this discussion in the from now to future.
Yeah. And you know, climate change is certainly a tough issue. I mean, just to convince all these countries with different national interests, I would say, to go green, that's very not easy. And how do you think can raising climate issues on the global stage can contribute to Korea's national interest?
Well, climate change and its ramifications is, without too much exaggeration, related to the survival of the race. And this is a very important issue. So addressing those issues as with the Korea's initiative raises the prominence of Korean soft power and the influence. So it's a very, diplomatically, I think, is a very important initiative. But on the other hand, we have this economy issue as well. The green technology and the new energy saving technologies, those can be a very important industries going forward. And I'm happy that this is not just a declaration by the current president. Korea has been preparing for this route for quite some time. GGGI is with us, and the Climate Fund is with us, and we have established Green Technology Center, which looks at the specific technologies. So Korea has been doing this for quite a while.
유엔이 추구하는 가치인 평화와 발전 그리고 인권은 바로 대한민국의 비전이 되었습니다. 1991년 남한과 북한이 유엔에 동시 가입하였습니다. 하지만 같은 언어, 문화, 그리고 역사를 공유하고 있는 남과 북이 유엔에서 두 개의 자리를 차지하고 있는 것은 분명 비정상적인 일입니다. 독일 통일이 유럽 통합을 이루어 새로운 유럽의 주춧돌이 되었다면 통일된 한반도는 새로운 동북아를 만들어가는 초석이 될 것입니다. 한반도의 평화 통일은 그 자체로 유엔의 설립 목표와 가치를 구현하는 데 기여할 것이라고 저는 확신합니다. 세계에서 유일하게 남아있는 이런 분단의 장벽을 무너뜨리는데 세계가 함께 나서 주시기 바랍니다.
One of the other main events, I mean the key events, really key event of her trip was her keynote speech at the UN General Assembly. And she's done speeches in English before. Actually, she spoke in English at the Climate Summit. And she's done Chinese speech in China, I think. But she chose Korean to speak at the General Assembly. Do you think there was a special reason for this? Or?
Well, it's by convention. In the General Assembly keynote speech, use the national language. But in other occasions, I think the President Park used what's most efficient in that meeting, which was English.
Okay, but some people are actually saying that she chose to speak in Korean at the General Assembly because she had a specific message for North Korea. Was that the case?
It might be possible.
It might be possible.
But as Professor Song mentioned, normally the many leaders prefer to speak their own language because it's a message to the world using their own mother tongues.
Right.
So, but North Korean delegation, as you noticed in the video clip,
Exactly.
just they said in front, the first row and the center area.
Exactly.
So when my president deliver the keynote statement speech, they're listening carefully, just to short distance, just to 1-2 meters.
Exactly.
So that's interesting.
And they didn't need the headphones, the
That's the
well, yeah, they don't need
merit
translation.
advantage.
And speaking of North Korea, she spent some time in the General Assembly speech to talk about this her vision of a peaceful unification. What was your takeaway points from her speech?
Well, she always had this principled but very constructive message, in my assessment. And she reiterated her proposal to build a trust relationship in the Korean Peninsula, focusing on the practical issues like environment, like livelihood and culture. And she specifically mentioned that we have this opportunity to preserve the DMZ area as one of the most eco-friendly area that's going to be a benefit for people in Korea, but for the world. So that's initiatives that we can build on so that economically, culturally, and in those small wins can lead to peaceful interactions with North Korea. But in doing so, she stressed again that one of the conditions is that it has to be a nuclear issue, and also this time she stressed that human rights situation has to be improved. And I think it's advice to the North Korea, because at this point, even in the human rights issue, I think the global community is kind of united and sending the strong message to North Korea that this is a deal breaker for any kind of friendly economic talks. So I think the North Korea has to own up to it, and they have to come to realization that there is a practical proposal on the table that if they take certain actions, like on the human rights and denuclearization, then there's going to be some practical implications for
but
their
there was
economy.
a lot of pressing, though. Yes.
Yes, if I made 1 or 2 items regarding nuclear issues and human rights. So North Korea is the only country in the world who conducted nuclear testing in the 21st century. So that's why my president strongly urged again to ban the North Korea's nuclear programs if they come out with a genuine intention for the denuclearization of the North Korea. So we are ready to provide necessary humanitarian and also massive economic cooperation. On the human rights front, so unlike last year, this year, last February, so COI, Commission of an Inquiry, they published their own report after 1 year investigations. It is a very powerful report with a strong recommendation. I think now North Korea have to listen those recommendations. So General Assembly will look into the recommendation and prepare for the new General Assembly resolution which contain those elements of the recommendation. So that's why this time, North Korea, they show a little bit different attitude on human rights. North Korea's foreign minister delivered his own the keynote statement, and in that statement, North Korea said they are ready to work with Human Rights Council and Office of High Representative of the Human Rights, discussing on technical cooperation on human rights. That's very small change, but I think the international efforts to have North Korea to move in right direction might be working, but slowly, because they still reject the recommendation made by COI. So we hope two issues, nuclear issues and human rights issues, can come back in the normal situations and resume the talks, six-party talks and human rights talks in Human Rights Council.
And she also became the first Korean president in history to attend the UN Security Council summit. How did that come about? What significance does it have?
I think it's historical because firstly, after joining United Nations 1992, Mr. Ryu mentioned, so past 23 years, we served in the Security Council as a non-permanent members only 2 times. So our term of the Security Council members will be over by the end of this year. So we don't know exactly when we'll take a seat again in the Security Council. And as Mr. Ryu mentioned, the new emerging threat in the international community is Ebola disease and the ISIL, the very extreme terrorism. So they discussed among 15 leaders, and they agreed on adopt a Security Council resolution 2178, which contains a strong message to the international community. 193 countries are united to defeat very brutal and cruel terrorists, of the foreign terrorists particularly. That's a significant meeting. So in addition to the General Assembly debate and this Security Council meeting, for our president to appear in presence of all 193 members is more important than ever.
And people like me, we of course pay a lot of attention to what she would say at the UN Security Council meeting, just because of her geographically uniquely positioned. But do you think people really paid a lot of attention to what she had to say at the UN Security Council meeting, and do you think that could bring a lot of influence?
Well, as I referred to Mr. Sin's statement, that the President Park's visibility at the most important meeting of the world is very significant, and in a way to showing that the leaders power of the country can participate or show as a reliable partner to fight against the global threat, terrorism, and also show it may empowering the other small and middle-sized countries to follow her suit as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of course, the subject itself, when it comes to Korea, if it is a matter of denuclearization of North Korea or the peace on Korean Peninsula, it might attract more global attention. But however, that her presence at the first time in UN history, Korea's history, to be there is very significant.
And Professor Song, what do you think?
One speech does not really change
Sure.
much, and there are a lot going on behind the scene to reach some kind of resolution or the consensus. But I think that our president delivered a very compelling message to a lot of people who can look to Korea's situation and say that Korea comes from the history and comes from the heart. So I think it must have been a very positive influence.
And up next, we're connecting to someone who we cannot do without when talking about the Korean president's UN diplomacy. Ambassador Oh Jun, permanent representative of Korea to the United Nations, is joining us on the program. Ambassador Oh, great to have you with us. Really appreciate it. So, South Korean President Park Geun-hye's UN debut with the presence of two major global leaders like UN Secretary General and World Bank President, who also happen to be Korean born as well. How did it make you feel?
Right here in the UN, there was a great deal of attention to President Park's participation in UN meetings, not least because this was her first such participation in any United Nations meeting. And at one meeting, there were four lead speakers, and they were President Park, President of Mexico, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and President Kim Yong-kim. So 3 out of 4 lead speakers were Korean at one meeting. That was very interesting.
And President Park Geun-hye certainly garnered a lot of global attention from day one in office, actually, given that she's the first Korean first leader who is a woman and who also happens to be at the heart of the Northeast Asia diplomacy. There is, of course, the North Korea factor, too. So what do you think her strengths are on the global stage?
But as you know, President Park is one of the few female presidents, head of state in Asia. Not only in Asia, but all over the world. Even some long-standing democracies have yet to have a female head of state. You know? But when she speaks, she is very substantive and to the point. So there is a lot of good assessment, a lot of good words coming from other participants and also world media.
And speaking from your capacity as the South Korean representative to the United Nations, what's your assessment of the world's expectation for South Korea?
Well, we all agree that Korea has come a long way. In the span of 3 or 4 decades, Korea has achieved not only economic and social developments, but also political democratization. So Korea is often cited as a model for development, either economically or politically.
All right, I'm afraid we'll leave it there for today. Ambassador Oh, thank you so much for coming on today. Oh Jun, a permanent representative of Korea to the United Nations there. And we also actually had a chance to speak with some of the specialists in this area to talk about the presidential trip to the United Nations. Let's take a look at some of the video clips.
President Park made a very important debut at UN General Assembly. I think the debut was quite successful. It was well received by the international community. I think there are at least 2 major components to her speech. One was to promote her vision of unification to the international community, and the second component was about the role of South Korea as middle power in the world. By pledging a substantial amount of financial support to the international environmental protection regime, President Park made sure that South Korea would live up to that expectation, would contribute to the international community greatly. I want the studio to talk more about the ways in which we can keep these 2 seemingly incompatible policies in tune with each other, how we can synchronize North Korean weapons policy and unification policy at the same time.
Unification issue has been only focused and contained in the Korean Peninsula and also relevant neighboring countries. But I think at the United Nations keynote speech, President Park Geun-hye made it a more global issues, asking more global support from the international community and United Nations. She mentioned very indirectly about the common, comfort women issues. My question is that does this imply that there might be a possibility for the summit meeting between Korea and Japan in the future? If possible, what has been the cause of it? I mean, the United States has mentioned that U.S. would not officially intervene between Japan and Korea, but there have been some measures, by the United States, I think. So, what's the future of Japan-Korea meeting? What is the future of U.S.-Korea-Japan trilateral meeting in the future?
I think it's great that she's endorsed the United Nations, the Commission of Inquiry report, which calls for a major reform in North Korea to deal with the human rights issues. That this is an urgent issue. We cannot wait one more day. So the question that I will put to, I guess, the panelists here, how do we move forward, particularly on these human rights issues? What is important going from here is what sort of procedures the United Nations and the international community and Korean government, what are we going to do? Specifically, what is the roadmap as we move forward in dealing with the North Korean human rights?
So let's talk North Korea. And first of all, North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Soo-young was pretty active in New York. It was the first time for a North Korean foreign minister to attend this meeting in 15 years. And lots of drama there, a bit different, I would say, coming from North Korea compared to the past. How did you read this?
Well, they were very active, and I think they had a good reason for it. As Mr. Shin has mentioned, this is the first time where that the report came out, and it was very specific about the kind of gross kind of violations that North Korea is doing. So in order to advance any kind of international agenda and to avoid further isolation in the international community, I think North Korea has a very big task in front of them. That's why they came out with their own human rights report, which unfortunately denies everything. But I think that there are some actions that are surely out of desperation. That's why I read it.
Okay, desperation. Well, I wonder, on the UN stage, is there any country that would explicitly express support for North Korea or not say anything to criticize North Korea?
Well, let's say it this way. In human relationship, we do not like to engage or be friend with unpredictable troublemaker, right? So North Korea is unpredictable troublemaker in the international community, where North Korea is state with a very few friends or friend with no good reputation. These countries typically share the anti-American sentiment or policies. So if your question pertains to what are the countries supporting North Korea, well, there is one example that it shows us even these countries do not advocate North Korea. For example, the UN Security Council passed a resolution to sanctioning North Korea by developing weapon of massive destruction, and these countries did not stand for doing anything for North Korea. So North Korea is very much isolated, and this is their own fault.
Not too many friends there, I would say. And you were there in New York. North Korea has been pretty active on the UN stage. Did it make your job any different?
Not so much, but it is quite worthwhile, and I think as the colleagues mentioned, it has merits because North Korea, they try to engage with the international community, particularly UN system. So the United Nations is now being headed by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the same Korean compatriot. But while they cannot accept the whole recommendations or the proposals made by the UN, but they are at least listening to some requests from the United Nations. And also, in the long run, I think they can come out to more positively even to the nuclear talks, six-party talks. That's our wishes, but as long as they are trying to engage with the international community, we don't think North Korea will have another risk to test nuclear weapons or continue to make serious human rights violations. So this is a merit. While we have dialogue and talks and engagement with North Korea, so at least they are now hesitant to make our situation further deteriorating. And the core issues of the human rights violation in United Nations is the final destination is who is going to be responsible, who should be accounted for these the issues. So that's why North Korea is very sensitive and the movement on their own issues, human rights in United Nations system.
Exactly. What do you think? Do you think it's a good strategy just to keep them talking at least for now?
I think so. Dialogue has to go on, but I'm just not very positive about their change in attitude. The report they came out with essentially says every country has a different standards of human rights, and they claim that the people in the North chose to follow whatever the party says, and on that basis, anything that the United States or other countries says or demands to North Korea is in fact interfering with the domestic matters. I think that goes patently against all the principles of human rights that have been established in 50 years of, or 70 years of history that we have in the international community. So unless they really become serious about adhering to the standards, probably their willingness to engage in the talks probably will not be heeded by a lot of countries.
We asked them, North Korea, to listen and come out for a dialogue table. And my president stressed how the main pillar of her philosophy on North Korean policy and reunification. You know, the 3 points agenda for our inter-Korean relations is agenda for humanitarian assistance, and we continue to provide our humanitarian assistance. So far this year, we gave North Korea about more than 13 million US dollars, a huge amount, particularly aimed to the mother and children's. So to addressing that malnutrition problems, and agenda for cooperation. So we suggest to the economic cooperation and also opening and the DMZ, the Peace Park,
Right.
and also lastly the reintegration to resolve the identity problems after reunification. We need exchange between people to people, improve the cultural exchange and some information exchange. So this is a basic theme of my president. Eventually it will lead to the peaceful reunification. And last part of her statement is, so one day we really wish to see these two delegations will sit together with one name plate, one Korea, without any other names in front. So that's quite touching, the remarks at the last part.
Okay. And one last question on North Korea, Professor. North Korea being pretty active on the multilateral diplomacy stage, does that make the two Koreas talking less of a possibility?
I would think that them coming to any kind of table is a good start. I think that they've been isolated long enough, and probably they would have assessed the situation to see that their usual tactics of brinkmanship and raising the intensity of the risk level in Korean Peninsula has not been that rewarding for them. So this kind of opportunity in a multilateral setting could lead to many talks with South Korea or even to the US. But until they get that, I think that they have heard thrice in this setting that there are some conditions they have to really work on.
Yeah, and another focal point of us in the press was the potential South Korea-Japan summit or any by chance kind of meet between the two leaders, but that did not happen because Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe skipped the UN General Assembly. I wonder if officials, sort of, accompanying heads of states, adjust or change the schedule so that you don't really have those unwanted buzz or unwanted meet of the two leaders?
I just want to correct that information first.
Sure.
Because Prime Minister Abe was there. Yeah, both leaders there, but they attend the different meetings.
A different meeting,
Yes,
so not the one that President Park was at. Okay.
Yes, and Prime Minister Abe delivered his keynote general debate statement next day after my president delivered.
Right.
So some difference in timing. But our government's position is quite clear. So we have no the reservation or opposition to hold the summit meeting with Japanese counterpart between two president and prime minister. But to resume our summit, at least that conditions should be made to discuss seriously on our pending issues, mostly that wartime sexual slavery, so-called conflict women case. But we cannot tell both sides ready to talks in the summit level at the time.
Well, like you said in the pre-interview, you said one of the benefits of the United Nations General Assembly is that you can have multi-bilateral meetings, and it would have been just easier to just say hello, I guess, on the sidelines. What do you think?
That's
Well,
not the meeting.
people normally expect a positive and constructive outcome when the heads of states meet. And as Mr. Sin said, as far as what's going on, the current situation, especially Korea and Japan relationship has been strained over the wartime sexual slavery issue as well as other issues. So as long as the Japan initiate certain approach to satisfy Korean government, this the summit meeting will not occur anytime soon.
And talking about Japan, we paid a lot of attention to her speech at the General Assembly and what she had to say about the historical issues with Japan. And she used to use the term sexual violence against women during wartime instead of Japan's history of wartime sexual enslavement and slavery. It seems a lot toned down. What did you think? What was your take on that speech?
Yeah, I think that there is a deliberate toning down a little bit. It's regrettable that Japan is maintaining the position about the historical issues that defies not only Korean, but the regional and even the global sense of justice and the sentiment. But the explanation we heard is that, well, because of the domestic issue, the long time doldrum of national spirits and what's going on in Japan, probably that's the reason why the Japan is risking or choosing to focus more on the domestic issues than others. Until that changes, probably Korea should not be going to any kind of summit meetings. At this point, that toning down is kind of gently tossing the ball to the other court, and it's again in the court of Japanese side. How they approach this issue and how they kind of change the ways to address the history. I think that's something that there are a lot of audiences to look at.
And some are actually saying the toned down version of her speech is because of the slight possibility of the Korea-Japan summit in the near future. Is that the right way to look at it?
I wouldn't look at it very quickly, but there is a positive sign that the ministers of both countries, foreign affairs ministries, already met. And the word is that nothing much came out, but there is a step towards probably next meeting somewhere down the road.
If I may add additional comment on my present statement on the wartime sexual slavery, so-called conflict women, I think her statement itself implies very strong message to Japan, because it's seriously wartime the sexual slavery. That issues seriously violates the human rights and the humanitarian law as a whole. And why my president didn't mention directly on that issues. At every occasion in United Nations and international conference, our working level and senior level, minister level raised that issues. But my president, I think that'll be enough to raise that issues in general terms, as Mr. Ryu said, and Professor Song. That's general audience of summit levels of 193. So we cannot specify every items one by one. I think that will be a good sense of the judgment at the present level of statement.
And to further assess South Korean President Park Geun-hye's UN debut, as well as to think about some of the challenges ahead for her in terms of multilateral diplomacy, Upfront had a chance to sit down with a very renowned Korean diplomat. Take a look.
Korea can make achievements today thanks to the support provided by the UN and the international community. So now we have an obligation to pay back what we've received. Based on our experiences developing the nation in the past, we should actively support developing nations and send peacekeeping forces where they are needed. Korea should spearhead efforts to help developing nations by sharing its experiences from the past. Korea should also make all-out efforts to help the UN achieve its Millennium Development Goals by 2015, and also participate in solving other global problems like eradicating poverty.
All right, so we've had a pretty good run so far talking about President Park Geun-hye's UN debut. Any final thoughts that you would like to add to wrap this up?
I think my president's visit and participation in the General Assembly, the outcome is quite successful and substantive and very constructive. Last time, so many statements by presidents or prime ministers were focused on inter-Korean relations or North Korean issues. But this time, as a leader of the middle power countries, my president stressed many important items of international issues, so-called the human rights issues and development cooperation, and how to share our experience with the poor countries using our Semaul Undong. And we are ready to provide the necessary assistance even to the conflict area. So the root cause of terrorism come from poverty and unemployment. So our ODA will focus on the assistance to those young people who are struggling to come out of their very poverty and frustrating the environment. So likewise, my president point out the whole items, how Korea can make contribution to the world peace and security and development and improving human rights situation.
And I want to hear your final remarks moving forward.
I think joining in saying that it was a stellar performance following her visit to China and the U.S. She looked like a significant leader, a global leader, addressing all those important issues in the world. We're building very steadily, becoming a very significant middle power. I think that one challenge at different level is that that success should translate into a kind of a momentum in domestic matters.
Of course.
It's a different setting. It's not a diplomacy, but we need the structural changes. So the task is harder. But I think that her kind of success would probably translate well in many areas, including climate change initiatives.
Certainly, I mean, hopefully this UN trip will give that much boost to her next multilateral and bilateral diplomacy. Thank you so much, all three of you, for coming in today and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our first episode of the brand new Upfront. Do tell us what you thought about it. We'll be happy to hear from you. Get in touch with us on our website, and we're on Twitter as well. Thank you for watching. See you next week.